The dog-headed Nephilim and Alexander the Great. There are serious indications and suspicions that their descendants are still among us. We even have reports of Christian priests who in the Middle Ages were telling their spiritual children not to marry people that did not have a proper profile. In other words, if their nose and chin, their bottom part of the face was out more than the forehead, that indicated that they could have been Nephilim. They could have had Nephilim roots. But the dog heads in the story of Alexander the Great, serious indications, suspicions that their descendants are among us. Whoever sees the true story and how the useful ancestry and act together with two-legged snakes that guide the first and blame their victims for what they did themselves to cover up their shame. Now, the fact that the masses are used to them because they have been among them since they were, paleontology, the beginning of anthropology, to make things look normal, and they were the first that were observed through perhaps the internet. And all of these elements that distinguish humans from animals are absent. They function completely mechanically through their lives. As Houston Stewart Chamberlain rightly said, from the smallest thing to the largest, regardless of the position and how many degrees they have, these people operate with not enough knowledge. Now, in a well-known variation of the novel by Callisthenes, The Myth of Alexander, which we also know as Pilada to Alexander the Great, a topic that I've mentioned, says the writer in a relevant article, the soldiers' encounter with the dog-headed Nephilim is mentioned. Let's remember that he had Alexander the Great in all his journeys. He had historians with him, scientists, doctors, people recording whatever was going on every single day. And of course, the Nephilim that they came across. Whatever he was not able to do away with, he would throw into pits and cover the pits with various metals and build pyramids on top of them. And he called them the abominable races. They were Nephilim, half man, half snake, half man, half goat, half man, half horse, like the centaurs. So on the 10th day, the topic, he says, I mentioned a relevant article, the soldiers' encounter, the soldier meaning Alexander the Great. On the 10th day of this he went to a place where the dog heads were, their bodies were human, their heads were like dogs, and their voices were human, and they walked like dogs. Alexander did away with many of them, and after 10 days leaving their place, he went to a village. This brief reference is apparently not enough to justify the extent of the presence of dog heads in later times and their strong influence on Byzantine texts and Christianity in general. As it seems, however, the story of Alexander the Great had another much greater penetrating ability, and there was no other Greek novel among the many others of the Hellenistic era. This excessive mythologizing and acceptance of Alexander the Great did not, of course, happen immediately. Each century that passed from his death onwards accumulated material for fiction and fantasy to such an extent that the myth has been alive until recently. Of course, the process of mythologizing Alexander is not so easily explained, but rather we must take things from the beginning to see the issue in its genesis. And the view is now accepted by all historians, researchers, and scholars of literature that the literary genre that we know as the novel is a Greek contribution to world literature, and this was invented in Greece during the Hellenistic years 330 to 30 BC. That's at the time Alexander the Great lived around 330 BC. Not under the name novel, but under the name dramatic speech. And this view is preserved by Patriarch Photius in his famous library of works, works of a similar form were still called drama, book or books, while in the medieval period we know them as stories. Clearly, the name novel is much later. Thomas Hagg, in his wonderful work, notes the following. The word Mythistoria appears for the first time in a Latin text of the 4th century AD to denote biographies containing insignificant facts or lies mixed with truths, and this term was proposed by Korais in 1804 for the ancient Greek novel instead of the barbaric romance, which he himself renders Romanon, with the following argument. He says, I consider this name, this description short and appropriate to be novel, which not only clearly signifies the nature of the thing, but is also a word for it, very Greek. From the previous classification, we see that the novel of Alexander belongs to the novels of that era, composed several centuries after the death of Alexander the Great by an anonymous author of 300 AD, because the work was attributed incorrectly to the historian Callisthenes of Olynthos, who accompanied Alexander on his campaigns. We call its author Callisthenes. The original attribution of the work to the historian Callisthenes was made by the Byzantine scholar John Tzedsis in the 12th century, and we find it again in various manuscripts of the work during 14th and 15th centuries. We also know it as a tale of Alexander the Great, or myth of Alexander, or the life of Alexander the Great and his deeds. And finally, we also know it as Callisthenes because of what has been mentioned. Another name for the work, a Byzantine adaptation in prose, because there are also various adaptations, bears the title History of Alexander the Great, His Life, Wars, and Death, and was printed as a book in Venice in 1699, with several later reprints. This adaptation is the best known. It was circulated in a cheap edition in poorly designed pamphlets and became known by the popular expression leaflet of Alexander the Great. From what I know, I think this leaflet is the most widespread form of narration of the adventures of Alexander the Great. Despite the monstrous untruths and often fantastic descriptions of the work, its author, Callisthenes, also known as Aesop, we know Aesop from Aesop Fables, relied on something to tell his myth. He used some models. Of course, he used the work of the historian Callisthenes. The Acts of Alexander, which remained incomplete due to the death of its author, the work includes a geographical description of the countries of Asia Minor, Syria, Phoenicia, etc., through which Alexander passed, without citing historical exaggerations and fictions, given that, as a historian of Alexander, he was clearly accurate and not at all a swindler. Precisely because he did not belong to the flatterers who surrounded Alexander the Great, he fell into his disfavor. So as a historical source, it was noteworthy. Another source of Callisthenes was the royal gazettes, which were compiled by the chief secretary of the court, a procedure that was in accordance with the custom of the Persian court. We assume that the royal gazettes were the official collection of data concerning the state and the kingdom in general, despite the fact that the word newspapers means something completely casual. I cannot imagine any other use for them than as an official archive of the kingdom, unless they were a form of newspaper, of course, handwritten, that was posted on the walls of the palace and contained various news. A third and final source for Callisthenes must have been the history of Alexander the Great by Ptolemy the First, who so exploited the myth of Alexander to consolidate his position on the throne of Egypt. Angelus Furiotis notes on this, it is not unlikely that the history, a work by Ptolemy I, one of the generals of Alexander the Great, formed the basis of the copies that circulated in the 2nd century AD, which may have subsequently formed the basis of the 3rd century AD variant. The second variant must have been made in the 2nd century AD because the basic element favors its composition at the time, the insertion within the novel of the hero's campaign in Italy and the conquest of Rome. This is an indirect revenge of the author against the Roman occupation. As for the complete composition of the entire novel, it's a work of the 3rd century AD, as is evident from the mention of the philosopher Favorins, the multitude of Asian emperors of Rome who bear the name Alexander, the chronology of the myths and traditions about Alexander, the verses that have been inserted into the novel, and the survivals in it of Ptolemaic elements and elements of the 2nd century AD, with a main emphasis on the insertion of letters Alexander to Aristotle and to Olympias, his mother. Aristotle, as we know, was his teacher. And correspondence Alexander Dindymus, king of the Brahmins, of India, of course, a means of making the narrative more popular and more action-rich, as was customary during the imperial Roman years. The citation or integration of the various letters into the life of Alexander is, according to scholars, a remarkable innovation. On the one hand, it enables the personality of the letter writer to be highlighted to make clear the subjective ability to judge, to give the perspectives from which he evaluates the various events, and on the other hand, to consolidate the degree of objectivity of what is described so that they are considered real. And it is no coincidence that it is precisely in this unrestricted epistolary writing that most of the fictional elements of the work are contained. A rich, unrestrained imagination that leaves nothing to be lost. It exploits every event, everything that is known to the author, everything that came to his attention or heard or read, so that this novel constitutes an alloy of historical truth and fantasy. These two elements are so inseparable, so firmly integrated into each other, that it takes great effort to separate them. To the tradition of Alexander's contact with the dog heads, the Nephilim, belongs a folkloric account from Romania, and it is interesting from the point of view of the dimension and distortion of the myth. God set Alexander the Great to punish the wicked. When Alexander defeated King Porus, he captured him and imprisoned him in the dark hollows of a hill range which enclosed the dog heads. From there, Porus cannot get out except in later times. Above these hills, Alexander the Great drove a pitchfork and placed a bell on it that rings by itself with the wind. The dog heads, the Nephilim, when they hear the bell, know that Alexander is there and is guarding them. They will come out in the end times and begin the work that God has destined for them. The dog-head Nephilim have one eye in their forehead and one in their neck. They are violent and extremely evil. Their speech is foul. They catch people and after fatten them, bake them in the oven and eat them. In other words, they're carnivorous for humans, right? Now, the following tradition says approximately the same thing. The wind moves the ships on the seas and cleanses the atmosphere of evil. It also rings the bell at Alexander the Great placed on the hills where the dog-headed Nephilim are locked up, who will come out after ages at the end times. Let's remember that in the book of Daniel, the archangel Gabriel gives prophecy concerning Alexander the Great, coming from northern Greece. These two traditions, which clearly belong to the cycle about Alexander the Great, present a new version. They invade the whole story of the one-eyed man-eater Cyclops, the so-called one-eyed ones, while a one-eyed dragon is mentioned in the fairy tale from Kerasunda, and there is also talk or allusions to beings with three eyes known as Trimates, who are also related to the Cyclops according to popular traditions. As Ansbacher argues, the myth of dogheads also extends in Arabic literature, something that is evident in the work of the Arab scholar Al-Qazwini, who refers to a race of dog heads that had a dog's face, a human body, and wings. a variation of the myth that we do not find anywhere else. The second variation involves dog heads with two bodies, and there are depictions of them in works of Wolfhard or Aldrovandi. As beings with a dual physical appearance, human and dog heads appear mainly among Slavic peoples, where popular literature considers them cannibals and sometimes identifies them with the Tartars. And in Greece, we have related references as Economidis states in Thrace, that is northern Greece. They say that dog-head Nephilim from the front are humans and from the back are dogs. From the front they speak and from the back they bark. From the front they treat you well, from the back they eat you. In the area of Sparta, Lacedaemon, they are said to have lived near the Vurlian and ate humans. In some Greek fairy tales, dog heads are similar to dragons, which the fairy tale hero fights and becomes the owner of these treasures. Similarities to dog heads are the Sikieneza of the Albanians, the Psoglavi of the Bulgarians, and the Kapkani or Katsuni of the Romanians, so as to get a more general Balkan idea of dog-head Nephilims. And the writer says, I suppose that in rough outlines, this is a comprehensive outline of the historical problem concerning the dog-headed Nephilims, at least until the end of the Middle Ages, when we again have a peculiar outbreak of information on the subject, as I've already mentioned, the writer says. In addition to Oderic de Paderne, the Franciscan monk, whom others called Oderico of Pordenone, the same theories were also advocated by John Mandeville, while the whole story, hence reference to monstrous people, intensified with the discoveries and explorations of the 15th century, but as the boundaries of the known world expanded due to these very voyages of exploration, rumors of the existence of a race of dog-headed people receded and information was limited to the mythological past. Apparently, this mythological past survived through another process, the presence in Christian history and iconography of a saint with a dog-headed appearance, Saint Christopher, the patron saint of motorists. How did this completely paradoxical phenomenon happen? When Christianity was established as the official religion of the Eastern Roman state, which we know as Byzantium, today Christian Orthodoxy, especially from the 4th to 6th century, the so-called pagans, that is, the Gentiles, the Greek Dodekatheis, who believed in the Olympian gods, suffered terrible persecution, and the religion was banned, at least officially, because in secret it survived for many more centuries. And not only did it survive, but it penetrated popular beliefs about Christianity and saints by inoculating them with various pagan customs, such as swallowing, stoning, etc. At the end of the art, among other things, this was realized mainly with the presence of dog-headed Saint Christopher, a unique and in a paradoxical sense, a characteristic of Byzantine art as presented in detail in his relevant work by Mr. Hodzakoglu. So we have references, of course, to the Nephilim. They were not even small, they were huge beings as well, in Greek mythology and history. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Please support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support, and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.